One of my most common questions is how to bulk up. So first we need to understand that what makes muscles grow. There are three mechanisms that lead to muscular hypertrophy: mechanical tension, metabolic stress, and muscle damage. Mechanical tension really seems to be the main stimulus for hypertrophy, and to get into science, it's basically the application of external mechanical load to a joint, which then results in force within the muscle. Okay, so here are the 5 factors with good certainty that when you open most scientific papers, you'll find these will lead to muscle growth. So number 1 is mechanical transduction. This happens when you put tension on the muscle fiber, and the fibers will deform and trigger chemical activity. Number 2 is myogenic signaling. Myo is just basically a Greek word for muscles, right? The muscle fibers will release growth factors to signal the need for repair. And number 3, mTOR signal integration. And in simple terms, this basically is just the translation of the signals to the genes to start muscle growth. The signals being amino acid availability and growth factors. So number 4, muscle protein synthesis. And I'm sure you've all heard of this, so MPS. This is where the damaged muscle fibers get removed and repaired and the new ones are rebuilt. Now this is actually the process of muscle growth, where the increase in myofibrillar muscle proteins get added onto the actual muscle tissue, which then makes your muscles bigger. For example, think of increasing the number of bricks on a wall, the bricks being the muscle proteins and the wall being the muscle tissue. And number 5 is myonuclear addition. There really seems to be a limit on how big a muscle can actually get based on how many nuclei are in a muscle fiber. In simple terms, think of a muscle fiber like a car. A car has seats in it, right? The car seats are the nuclei and they contain the DNA. There's really a limit on how many people you can fit into the car based on the number of car seats, right? So this means you need to add more car seats, which again are the nuclei, to fit more people in, therefore increasing the muscle fiber size. So I think the practical application that we could pull away here is just lift more weight over a period of time. The second mechanism of muscular hypertrophy is metabolic stress, and this is the muscle pump. So it's the accumulation of metabolite byproducts in the muscle like lactate, phosphate, hydrogen ions, and hypoxia. Metabolic stress will increase these 5 factors. Although many bros will tell you that the muscle pump is everything, let's look at what the science says. So in a study, they compared cluster sets compared to traditional set training. They found out that cluster sets had the same growth as traditional sets despite them having less metabolic stress, and the cluster sets led to greater volume load. Looking at the second study, and this one investigated post-exercise blood flow restriction, and all they did was apply blood flow restriction cuffs after they'd done a set of dumbbell curls. Now this was just to see that if you increase the amount of metabolic stress, will it lead to muscle growth directly? What they found is that muscle growth was the same, and in women they actually lost some muscle mass. So looking at the science literature, to me it looks like metabolic stress is not an independent stimulus for muscle growth. However, that said, metabolic stress increases muscle activation and therefore increases mechanical tension. This means the more muscle activation there is, the harder the muscles are contracting and the more tension on them. So therefore, metabolic stress increases mechanical tension, which will indirectly lead to more muscle growth. So I think a good practical application that we can take away is that maybe sometimes we should focus on chasing the muscle pump, but it really shouldn't be our primary focus. The third apparent mechanism of muscle growth is muscle damage. Now this is the tearing of the muscle fibers, the membranes, etc. You know you've done a lot of muscle damage if you're sore the next day. So I guess the question then becomes, should you feel sore after every single workout? And later on in the video, I'll cover constant tension, rest duration, everything that you can think about when it comes to building muscle mass. So if we look at the first scientific study, they wanted to see if myofibril protein synthesis and muscle damage was correlated to muscular hypertrophy. Now, if we look at figure B, we can see that muscle damage is quite high, but so is muscle protein synthesis, right? However, if we look at figure C, once we correct for muscle damage, muscle protein synthesis, muscle growth is not significant anymore. Muscle damage actually correlates with protein breakdown as well, not muscle growth itself. Therefore, if protein synthesis rates do increase, this is not for muscle growth itself, this is actually to repair the muscle tissue. So, in the study, when muscle damage was at its highest, so was muscle protein synthesis rates, but neither were related to hypertrophy. only when it was corrected for muscle damage. So, in simple terms, muscle protein synthesis was correlated with muscle cross-sectional area, not the actual muscle damage itself. Looking at the second scientific study, and this one really wanted to investigate if muscle damage was necessary for muscular growth. Now, they had a pre-trained group and a naive group. The pre-trained group actually had a few weeks to acclimate themselves, whereas the naive group had the exact opposite. Now, if we look at the figure there, we can see that plasma creatine kinase levels, which are a good marker for muscle damage, was very high on week 5 for the naive group, and for the pre-trained group, they had a kind of introduction to this. Looking at the second figure here, we can see that the naive group experienced a lot more pain than a pre-trained group. Naive group probably couldn't sit in the toilet, pre-trained group probably could. Alright, enough of that. Biggest strength of this study is that the total work was equated, and this is massive. Also, increases in strength and muscle volume, so muscle size, were the same in both groups. Eccentric muscle actions are thought to lead to greater muscle damage compared to concentric muscle actions. The eccentric is just the lowering phase on most exercises. Now, this is probably due to greater tension because you can lift more weight when the weight's coming down, or maybe just the nature of the tension when the muscle is lengthening. Now, if we look at a study by Brad Schoenfeld and colleagues, 15 studies, they done a meta-analysis and they favored eccentric compared to concentric muscle actions for muscle size. Now, if you look at that, you draw the conclusion. However, total work was not equated in every single study, and we know that total work is very important when it comes to muscular hypertrophy. So what practical application can we pull away here? Number 1, muscle damage could lead to extended recovery times, increased protein breakdown, and probably the biggest one is we could be too sore to train, and that can impact our volume load. So for all the bros that think you need to be sore every workout, maybe reconsider. So my opinion on this would just be, don't obsess over the eccentric part of the exercise and feeling sore after every workout. So let's conclude the 3 mechanisms of muscle growth before we move on to training to failure, constant tension, all that great stuff. So in my current opinion, I believe that metabolic stress increases mechanical tension, and rather mechanical tension is a byproduct of muscle damage. So the driving force for muscle growth is mechanical tension. And I wouldn't draw the line in the sand just yet, but this is my current opinion. Now, the first factor related to muscle growth is volume load or total work. This is one of the primary drivers for muscle growth. Looking at the science, we can start off by looking at a meta-analysis done by James Krieger and colleagues. They found that the more you increase your volume load, the more muscle growth you'll get up to a point, which in geek terms is a dose-response relationship. Now, before drawing a conclusion, there are some limitations to consider. The first is age. There was massive differences there, training experience, and they used different measurements like DEXA and MRI. That said, they're looking at another study done by Brad Schoenfeld. They wanted to investigate the comparison of volume over 8 weeks between low loads and high loads. The study found out that doing low loads actually resulted in greater volume load. However, again, few limitations to consider. The low load group, which was doing higher reps, had a great impact on buffering capacity, so also increasing their lactate threshold, which meant more reps, which meant greater volume load. Another limitation is that it was a novel stimulus, so it was brand new to them, therefore they was able to get those gains quicker. Moving on to relative load, or some might refer to this as intensity. The big question there is, were the bros right? Is the 6 to 12 rep range required for muscle growth? So looking at another meta-analysis, and this one was done by Brad Schoenfeld. This one wanted to investigate if high relative loads during resistance training is better than low relative loads on gains and muscle size. So they found a non-significant trend for higher loads for greater muscle size than with low relative loads. Looking at the same study that we discussed in volume load, where they compared over 8 weeks a low versus high load and which one was better, again they found that the low load resulted in greater accumulations in volume load. However, like we discussed, there were some limitations to this. I guess a big question then becomes, is there a threshold of relative load that we need to lift in order to get a good stimulus for muscle growth, aka hypertrophy? In my current opinion, and based on no scientific knowledge or research or whatever, is that there is definitely some relative load that we need to lift for muscle growth. Because, you don't see people walking around the street, going shopping, and then getting bigger muscles out of daily activities. Looking at the last study done by Campos and colleagues, we can see that low reps were just as effective for muscle growth when total work is equated. Now, even if you look at the abstract, you can see that the low to moderate intermediate rep range induced a greater hypertrophy effect on muscle growth compared to the high rep range. So relating all of this to mechanical tension and metabolic stress, we know that a greater relative load, so heavier weight in most cases, is going to lead to greater mechanical tension, which we know is a primary factor for muscle growth. One, because a greater relative load is just heavier, and two, a greater relative load is going to require slower bar speeds and therefore a longer rep duration, which could lead to more motor units being active for a longer period of time. Now, metabolic stress, when we perform more reps during a set, so this is going to be with low to moderate load, so let's say 6 to 20 reps, this could lead to greater metabolic stress, aka remember the muscle pump, and therefore lead to more acute cellular hydration compared to a set with a higher weight. The practical application that we can pull away is that a greater relative load might possibly be better for muscle growth than a lower relative load because of the amount of tensile force you can produce in the muscle. Now, is there a certain threshold? I'm really not sure, and to my current knowledge, I don't know if there's any evidence out there that shows this. Now, regardless of what loading range you're working at, as long as the total work is equated, the muscle size or muscle growth will be similar. Moving on to training to failure, and many definitions are thrown out there, but let's just stick to one. Now, the magic of training to failure is just altering motor unit recruitment, especially at the start of the set. For example, if you picked up real heavy weight, you're going to recruit greater number of motor units compared to if you lift up really lightweight at the start of the set. Now, some people might throw out some EMG data, however, that's not necessarily reflective of how many motor units are recruited, as shown by this study. So looking at the first study that wanted to investigate training to failure with high and low intensities, they found out that training volume was actually higher in the 80% of 1RM group, and this is not what you typically see due to volume load, right? However, this clearly shows that you can't compare training volumes against a big difference between a 1RM. And also, training to failure does also increase fatigue, which I'll get into later. Probably the biggest limitation I would say in the study is they didn't know how short of failure the subjects actually stopped, because it was just until they decided to stop. Looking at the second study, and there are three groups. The first group training to failure, the second group not training to failure but with equal volume, and a third group just not training to failure. There were significant improvements in training volume for reps to failure and reps not to failure but with volume equated. There were also significant improvements in muscle thickness in reps to failure and reps not to failure volume equalized. And this indicates that strength gains and muscle gains are not actually well correlated in untrained subjects, which I guess is a massive limitation on most of these studies. So training far short of muscular failure could lead to inferior muscular gains, and training to failure also increases fatigue and therefore increases muscle activation. Now, we know that high levels of muscle activation are necessary to maximize muscle growth. So the practical application that we can take away here is that you should be training to muscular failure sometimes, but it doesn't need to be every single set. Therefore, maybe take a final set to muscular failure and use that as a good indicator of how much progress you're making. So next is training frequency. Now, the definition that we're going to use here is the number of times that a muscle group is trained each week. So if we look at a meta-analysis done by James Krieger and colleagues, we can find out that training each muscle group 2 to 3 times per week led to more muscle gains than training it once per week. Therefore, the practical application that we can take away is that train each large muscle group at least 2 to 3 times per week, so you can do an upper lower split or a push pull leg split. So moving on to rest periods, Now the typical bro is going to tell you to rest 60 to 90 seconds after each set to get a muscle pump and accumulate more metabolic stress. However, the main factor you need to consider is controlling for volume. And by this I mean is when you reduce the amount of time you rest, this means you're going to get less repetitions in the next set and therefore get less volume load. So therefore it's likely that using shorter rest periods will reduce your volume and therefore also reduce the stimulus provided by the mechanical load. So if we look at the science and we look at the first study by Menno Henselmans and Brad Schoenfeld, they actually found out that shorter rest periods are not required for muscle growth. Now if we look at the second study by Campos et al. In 2002, like we did on relative load, using the same study, but this time again showing that similar muscle growth occurs between medium, high and low rep ranges when work is equated. So the practical application that we can get away here is that rest long on a compound exercises, maybe about 3 to 5 minutes, and therefore allowing us to get more mechanical tension, and maybe on our isolation exercises we can rest 1 to 2 minutes. Now again, it seems to come down to the amount of total volume that you do. So one of the biggest questions in a bro bodybuilding is, should you be keeping constant tension on a muscle? So if we look at one study done by Goto and colleagues, they found a significant increase in muscle cross-sectional area of 48.7% for partial range of motion and 28.2% for full range of motion. So that's a massive increase. So just drawing a conclusion from that, you think, okay, keep constant tension on a muscle. However, there are a few limitations to consider. Looking at another scientific study investigating on how deep you should be squatting to maximize a holistic training approach. So what they found is that training a muscle at longer lengths, so full range of motion, led to greater muscle activation, better neuromuscular efficiency, and greater hypertrophy, aka muscle growth. Now this is not just the only study that found that full range of motion led to better muscle growth than partial range of motion. Many studies have found this conclusion as well. So to conclude, full repetitions will stimulate more muscle activity over the entire muscle length. They will also stretch the muscle under higher tension, and also because you're moving the load through a greater distance, so full range of motion is moving further, this means more work is being performed, work being force times distance. Now, greater work done leads to greater training volume, and we all know what that means, superior muscle gains. So what's the practical application that we can take away here? It's train through a full range of motion with the majority of your exercises. It doesn't need to be all, but specific exercises like a barbell skull crusher, maybe a pec deck, maybe that's when you want to have a partial range of motion because of the bad resistance curve. So moving on to bar speed, or as the bros was saying, time under tension. So looking at the first study by Brad Schoenfeld and colleagues, and this one found that again no effect of bar speeds on muscle size, or significant effect at least, and effort and fatigue levels were a lot greater with a slower bar speed, which meant longer rep durations. Now looking at the second study by Moore, this one found out that the increase between muscle size again was very similar between eccentric muscle actions and concentric muscle actions. Again, keyword here, when work was equated. So slow bar speeds will lead to a longer rep duration, however involve lower relative load, so lighter weight. This means also less force and therefore might lead to less muscular hypertrophy. So the practical application here is that, surprisingly enough, concentrate on a total volume load and not so much your lifting tempo. I mean, as long as you're controlling the weight, it's absolutely fine. The evidence when it comes to time under tension and eccentric muscle actions is a bit of a mixed bag, because some studies favoring the untrained subjects and other studies looking at trained subjects, so it's kind of difficult here. So moving on to exercise selection, and some exercises have actually been found to activate some muscles within a muscle group to a greater extent than others. So different regions of the same muscle are stimulated by different exercises. So training with a larger exercise variety is probably thought to bring about greater muscle mass gains than training with a smaller exercise variety, and this is most likely due to the regional hypertrophy differences. Alright, so these are the 6 steps that you need to be following when you're designing your own training program. So number 1 is the limit factor. So Is your grip letting you down in a deadlift or doing pull-ups? Number 2 is compound exercises, and I'm big on this one because most skinny guys always skip these. You need to understand that compound exercises will allow your body to spread more force across multiple joints, and it's also a more natural way for your body to move. And number 3, range of motion. You should be definitely using full range of motion on the majority of your exercises, and this is actually going to increase mobility for that movement pattern and also actually increase the muscle length, because muscle growth is not just in parallel, it's also in series. So when you do these exercises, for every pulling or pushing movement, make sure you touch your body at some point during the exercise. So if you're doing a seated cable row, make sure that little V bar is touching your stomach. Number 4, tissue stress distribution. Now the more an exercise actually applies force to the targeted structures, so in this case muscle mass, and less stress being applied to the peripheral tissues, the better the exercise. And also the more an exercise forces your body into a specific movement, which I'll get into in a second, the worse the exercise. So as you probably could have guessed it, dumbbells are probably better than barbells, and barbells are better than the machines, because when you jump on a machine, anyone does the same movement pattern, but if you have dumbbells, that's just going to go all over the place. And saying that free weights have acceptable tissue distribution, whereas machines not so much. And this is probably the big one here, is the closed kinetic chain exercises like push-ups are more superior than open kinetic chain exercises like a flat dumbbell press. Basically, a closed kinetic chain exercise is where you move, whereas the open one is where the object moves. So the reason for this is because closed chain exercises allow your body to take the stress off the joints and determine how much the joints move, and therefore place more emphasis on the muscles doing the work. So number 5 is your strength and resistance curve. Now the closer your strength curve to your resistance curve, the better the exercise. Exercises that require the weight to move vertically, so pull-ups, have a constant resistance curve. However, exercises in which the weight moves in a circular fashion, like a barbell curl, has a maximal resistance at the horizontal point, so when it gets to about 90 degrees it gets really hard, but when it's vertical, so right at the top, there's almost very little resistance. Step number 6 is micro add ability. So you want to pick an exercise that you can lift a lot of weight with, but you can also add small incremental loads, so ideally there's very small plates. So the practical application that we can take away here is pick exercise with a constant resistance curve, and for the exercise variety, maybe change your isolation exercises up every single month, and the compound exercises, change them up maybe every 3 months, swapping one out and one in. So next up is advanced training techniques like drop sets, supersets, rest pause sets, and jumping straight to the practical application because there's not much said here. Some of them will allow you to get more volume in a shorter period of time, like a rest pause, but again, just make sure you focus on the total volume. That is still king. So that's basically all you need to know when it comes to bulking up and the training side of things. If you'd like me to make another video on nutrition science explained, please let me know, and let me know if you made it this far in the video. I'd like to know. Subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed it, if you found it informative. Stay positive, stay smiling, and as always, I'll see you next one.